Every year, the G20 follows a small ritual. The host country ends the summit by lifting a small wooden gavel, and it passes it to the next in line, the next country hosting the G20. It's a bit like passing the baton. But this time it did not happen. And that has kicked off a big diplomatic feud, a feud between the United States of America and South Africa. Here's how it began. South Africa hosted the G20 summit this year. It was a big deal for them. For the first time ever, an African country was playing host. But Donald Trump ruined their moment. He boycotted the summit. He did not attend the event. He did not even send a senior representative. And you can imagine how that landed in Pretoria, not well at all. What's worse, the next host is the United States. The G20 summit will be held in Miami in the Trump National Doral Golf Resort.
Could there be a G20 minus South Africa? Now that question comes up because President Donald Trump has barred South Africa from next year's G20 summit to be held in Miami. Yes, you're hearing that right. In an unprecedented move against a founding member of the Global Economic Forum, and a decision that South Africa says is punitive, misleading and fundamentally dangerous for international cooperation, the US, as the president of next year's summit, has decided to bar the country. After months of the escalating tensions between the two sides, a decision that is now being seen as a bid to silence Africa's most industrialized economy. After trade penalties, foreign policy collisions, as well as, and perhaps most importantly, Trump's claims of what he calls white genocide in South Africa.
Let's shift focus to a growing rift between the US and South Africa that has forced other global powers to intervene. Europe has urged US President Donald Trump to reconsider his decision to bar the African nation from the G20 summit next year. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said he will try to convince Trump to invite all members of the bloc. He added that a rift with South Africa is not in Washington's interest. Merz also emphasised that the G20 is one of the most important multilateral formats. The bloc accounts for 85% of the world's GDP and 2/3 of its population.
I regretted that the American government was not present in Johannesburg last week.
The US capital will be welcoming the Sherpas from the G20 nations on both Monday and Tuesday of this coming week. But South Africa has been given the cold shoulder. A founding member of the grouping, South Africa now finds itself on the outside. It's all over unproven claims by the Trump administration that the South African government is standing by while white genocide takes place in the country. Pretoria, of course, have denied those claims, but the relationship between President Cyril Ramaphosa and Donald Trump has dramatically worsened with this latest G20 snub. Cameron Hume served as US ambassador to South Africa between 2001 and 2004, and he's concerned about the wider impact that South Africa's exclusion will have.
We now move to South Africa, where the government has hit back after President Donald Trump said the US will not invite the African country for the G20 next year, which is to be held in Miami. President Cyril Ramaphosa has described Trump's announcement as regrettable. This comes after Trump, in a social media post, repeated unfounded claims of genocide and land seizures against white Afrikaners. He also said South Africa's refusal to hand over the G20 presidency in Johannesburg led to his decision.
They are killing white people and randomly allowing their farms to be taken from them. Perhaps, worst of all, the soon-to-be out-of-business New York Times and the fake news media won't issue a word against this genocide. At the conclusion of the G20, South Africa refused to hand off the G20 presidency to a senior representative from our U.S.
And welcome back. High tensions have erupted between Pretoria and Washington this week after US President Donald Trump announced that South Africa would be barred from the 2026 G20 summit and face the immediate suspension of US financial support. Trump cited alleged horrific human rights abuses and claims of farm seizures, accusations that have been widely rejected as false and misleading. South Africa, backed by international and local voices, insists that it remains a full sovereign member of the G20. The FW de Klerk Foundation and diplomatic representatives, including the German ambassador, have publicly defended South Africa's right to participate. President Cyril Ramaphosa's administration has confirmed that the country will continue to engage actively in all G20 processes to break down the implications.
Tensions between the United States, Europe, and South Africa have entered a new and unusually visible phase as reports of Washington reassessing South Africa's role in major multilateral forums triggered diplomatic reactions across capitals. The situation highlights deeper global shifts already underway, where Africa's strategic importance has risen sharply while Western unity on foreign policy priorities has become increasingly fragile. South Africa's position within the G20 has long been tied to its status as Africa's most industrialized economy, and a key representative of the Global South in global economic governance. Since joining the G20, Pretoria has used the platform to advocate for debt relief, development financing, reform of international financial institutions, and greater representation for emerging economies. Its participation has also symbolized Africa's growing voice in global decision-making. However, relations between South Africa and the United States have been strained in recent years. Disagreements over foreign policy alignment, particularly regarding Russia, China, and Middle Eastern conflicts, have created unease in Washington. South Africa's emphasis on strategic non-alignment and its role within BRICS has increasingly clashed with U.S. expectations of political alignment from key partners. The controversy escalated when political figures in the United States openly questioned South Africa's reliability as a strategic partner. Statements framing South Africa as drifting away from Western interests sparked concern among diplomats and investors alike. The situation intensified amid claims that a future U.S. administration could leverage diplomatic pressure by limiting South Africa's participation in elite forums, including high-level summits connected to U.S. influence. While the G20 is not controlled by any single country, the United States wields considerable influence within the group. Suggestions that Washington could discourage or obstruct South Africa's involvement sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Such a move would be unprecedented and controversial, raising questions about the politicization of multilateral institutions. Europe's response was swift and notably firm. European Union officials emphasized the importance of inclusivity and continuity within global forums, warning against turning multilateral platforms into instruments of political punishment. Several European capitals privately expressed concern that excluding South Africa would destabilize relations with the African continent as a whole. For Europe, South Africa represents more than a regional partner. It is a gateway to African markets, a political anchor in southern Africa, and a critical player in global climate negotiations. European investments in South Africa span energy, manufacturing, mining, and logistics, making political stability and diplomatic respect a matter of direct economic interest. The European Union has recently deepened its engagement with South Africa through trade agreements, energy transition partnerships, and infrastructure financing. These initiatives are part of Europe's broader strategy to maintain influence in Africa amid growing competition from China, Russia, and Gulf states. Any perception that the West is sidelining Africa's leading economies risks undermining that strategy. Diplomatic sources suggest European leaders viewed the controversy as a test case for the future of multilateralism. Allowing a major African country to be marginalized would send a signal that global governance structures are vulnerable to unilateral political agendas. For Europe, which relies heavily on rules-based systems, this was seen as a dangerous precedent. South Africa's government responded cautiously but firmly. Officials reiterated the country's commitment to dialogue, multilateral cooperation, and peaceful diplomacy. At the same time, they rejected any notion that participation in global forums should be conditional on political alignment with any single power. Pretoria's stance reflects a broader trend across Africa. Many African governments are resisting pressure to choose sides in an increasingly polarized world. Instead, they are pursuing diversified partnerships that maximize economic and political flexibility. This approach has gained momentum as Africa's population growth, resource wealth, and market potential make it indispensable to global economic planning. The controversy also exposed fractures within Western alliances. While the United States has taken a more confrontational tone toward governments perceived as insufficiently aligned, Europe has increasingly prioritized pragmatic engagement. This divergence has been evident in policy toward Africa, where European leaders fear losing ground if relationships are defined by coercion rather than cooperation. Global markets reacted cautiously to the diplomatic tension. Investors are sensitive to signals that political disputes could disrupt trade access, investment flows, or development financing. South Africa's economy, already navigating structural challenges, remains deeply integrated into global supply chains. Any hint of diplomatic isolation raises concerns about risk premiums and capital flight. The episode also reignited debate over Africa's representation in global governance. Critics argue that the continent remains underrepresented relative to its population and economic potential. Moves that appear to sideline African voices reinforce perceptions of inequality in international decision-making structures. Within Africa, reactions were closely watched. Regional leaders and policy analysts viewed the situation as emblematic of broader power struggles. There is growing recognition that Africa's collective influence depends on solidarity and strategic coordination when dealing with major powers. The G20 itself stands at a crossroads. Originally designed to bridge advanced and emerging economies, it now reflects a world marked by geopolitical rivalry and competing blocs. If participation becomes politicized, the group's credibility as a forum for global problem-solving could be undermined. Europe's intervention signaled an attempt to stabilize the situation before it escalated further. Diplomatic engagement behind closed doors reportedly focused on de-escalation, reassurance, and reaffirming shared commitments to multilateral norms. European leaders emphasized that disagreements should be managed through dialogue, not exclusion. For the United States, the situation highlights the limits of unilateral pressure in a multipolar world. Africa's growing importance means that relationships are increasingly transactional and balanced. Efforts to impose political costs may backfire by pushing partners toward alternative alliances. South Africa's role within BRICS further complicates the picture. As the bloc expands and gains visibility, Western policymakers face a strategic dilemma: how to engage countries that seek cooperation across competing global frameworks. Exclusionary tactics risk accelerating the very shifts they aim to prevent. The controversy also underscores Africa's rising leverage. As competition for influence intensifies, African countries are no longer passive recipients of policy decisions made elsewhere. They are active participants shaping outcomes through diplomacy, market access, and strategic partnerships. Looking ahead, the episode may serve as a warning sign. Global institutions are under pressure, and their legitimacy depends on fairness and inclusivity. Attempts to weaponize participation could erode trust and effectiveness at a time when coordinated responses to economic instability, climate change, and security challenges are urgently needed. Europe's decision to intervene reflects a broader recalibration of its Africa policy. Recognizing that credibility matters, European leaders appear determined to avoid actions that could alienate key partners or undermine long-term strategic interests. For South Africa, the situation reinforces the importance of diplomatic agility. Balancing relationships with major powers while maintaining policy independence remains a central challenge. The country's response will likely influence how other African states navigate similar pressures in the future. Ultimately, the controversy reveals a changing global order. Power is more diffuse, alliances are more fluid, and influence is increasingly contested. Africa, once peripheral to these dynamics, now sits at the center of global strategic calculations. Whether this episode leads to lasting diplomatic damage or renewed commitment to multilateral cooperation will depend on how major players choose to move forward. What is clear is that Africa's role in global governance can no longer be taken for granted or sidelined without consequences.
You've been watching Echoes of Africa, where every story carries the sound of tomorrow. If this moved you, subscribe now, like, and share so Africa's voice never fades into silence.